Welcome back to Beyond Bandwidth, Leviton's podcast series where we dive into network technology's hottest topics. I am your host from Leviton Network Solutions, Roy Chamberlain. Now, if you haven't listened to all of the episodes this season, I highly recommend hitting the ones you've missed. This season has been genuinely fascinating. So whether you're commuting to work, going for a walk or a run, descending down into the Mariana Trench in a submersible, or maybe you're just stuck on an international space station because your government no longer has the funds to bring you back. While you're waiting for Elon Musk's rescue rocket to deliver you to planet Earth, tune into Beyond Bandwidth and learn about AI data centers with me, Mike Connaughton, and our amazing crew of guests. And to tee it up for you, today Mike and I will reminisce, sharing our thoughts and highlights from this season here in our closing episode of Season 2. We hope you enjoy it. All right, well, welcome back to Beyond Bandwidth, Mike.
Hey, glad to be here.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the episodes that primarily you were able to speak with some of the best and most interesting, knowledgeable people in the industry on this topic, AI data centers. Just to start off, what do you think is the most interesting information or knowledge that you heard during your conversations this season throughout the episodes?
Yeah, it's not a specific piece of information, but I thought the Q&A session, which is episode 5, I really thought that was great. One, just kind of doing it. But, it's not often that you get a group of high-level experts from different disciplines all sitting at the same table and just having an open conversation on technologies. And I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners have never had that opportunity otherwise. And when you're listening to it, and we were going through it, the panelists were asking each other questions, which in my experience, I've never seen a panel discussion where the panelists actually asked each other questions. And that to me was because the panelists were learning things. I think that's kind of indicative of this whole subject matter. It's still new. People are still learning from each other, and hopefully listeners are learning from us as the season has gone on.
Yeah, completely agree. It was very dynamic and good chemistry, and that panel was fortunate to be there. The most interesting thing to me was in episode 3, which was part of that panel discussion, right? Brooke Ford, when he talked about the hollow core fiber technology, I really hadn't heard much about that. What do you think of that stuff?
It's interesting. Between college, I got out of college in the 80s, been working actively in the fiber industry since 1990. So, over the course of time, I've seen a lot of interesting designs of optical fibers over the years. At the end of the day, any technology, it's not just optical fiber, but any technology, it's got to solve a problem cost effectively. Right. And until that happens, it's still just an interesting idea. Now, with that one, what I think is one of the more interesting aspects of it is that Microsoft purchased, it's a few years ago now, but they purchased one of the leading manufacturers, a company called Luminicity. So now you have this major end user that's got a vested interest, not just in the application of it, but the technology. So, we'll see if this turns into a mainstream product.
Yeah, it is interesting. And Brooke had brought up a lot of those points as well. So before Brooke spoke, we heard from Jonathan Jew, who's a wealth of knowledge, and he lays out kind of the competition between Intel, AMD, NVIDIA on these GPUs and processing units for AI data centers, most specifically noting how Intel had already reached 800 gig in their processing points. Now, after 10 episodes, 6 months gone by, do you see any changes in the competition of who is rising between these manufacturers for these processing units? Are there any new players in the game that have come about?
Yeah, in that piece of the market, specifically like the GPU servers, NVIDIA has such a huge lead. You hear numbers like 85, 90% market share. It's
Yeah,
inconceivable how big a lead they have. But it's more than just chips and servers with them. There's this whole ecosystem of software services, whether they provide it themselves or they have partners that provide it. It did come up in the Q&A session too, talking with Jonathan. I do believe that competition drives innovation. So we're going to see AMD and Intel gain ground. Again, I don't have access to actual market share data, but just kind of seeing names on documentation. I've been seeing AMD and Intel come up in conversations more past couple of months than I did a year ago, because I think, if nothing else, customers are going to demand it one way or the other. It's good for customers when there's competition, and also certain that there's somebody we've never heard of that's working on another solution that's going to be popular somewhere down the road. But
Yeah.
for sure, AMD and Intel, because 800 gig, again, that was new, that was released, whatever, earlier this year, maybe a year ago at this point. Everybody essentially has access to that same technology. It's just a matter of kind of implementing it and getting that up to speed.
Yeah, just like you said, I have heard AMD more and more. And interestingly enough, it's been actually in circles when conversations on the stock market, and investing. So obviously it means they're doing things because people are looking to invest in them.
Yeah.
So sticking with that panel discussion, Nick Taylor, which was episode 4, he was focusing on cooling for AI data center processing chips. Are you aware of any other ways we're cutting heat from AI data center processing besides external cooling? Maybe newer chips are in development that do not produce or hold the heat, or alternative processing technology that might solve issues, or any other ideas out there? Are we kind of stuck with this external cooling solution because we talk about immersion, but obviously, geez, if we could avoid that, right, it would make life simpler, maybe. I guess everything gets more complex, but with all the conversations you do have, is anything new coming out or that you're hearing of ideas on that subject?
Yeah, so there's kind of two sides of the coin that you talk about there that have to be addressed. One is the power consumption of the chips. So how do you reduce that? And there's a few different ways. Now, interestingly, I saw a presentation maybe a month or so ago that talked about kind of the efficiency of the electrical circuitry in there. And it's, at least in this presentation, it was saying it was essentially plateauing. Like, there might be some efficiency gains, but it's small. It's like 3, 4, 5%. It's not going to make a difference. But then you also have the cooling side of it. How do you make that more efficient? But you mentioned a minute ago, Brooke, talking about hollow core fiber. The other thing Brooke talked about in some of these emerging technologies were different types of transceiver technologies. One is, linear pluggable optics, or LPOs, and the other is co-packaged optics. The reason for those is to reduce the amount of power. It doesn't reduce the power of the chip exactly, what we think of as kind of the GPU chip, but it reduces the power of the ASIC. It reduces the power of the system, if they're successfully implemented. And that can be significant, but it's not enough. And Nick did a great job of explaining the pros and cons of the different cooling technologies. I mean, one thing I'd throw in there, a lot of people view immersion cooling as inevitable, but I don't think of anything as inevitable,
Right.
except for, those two other things.
Right.
This is probably in any technology, certainly in our business, this is the biggest problem. So I gotta believe there's a lot of creative engineers out there working on solutions. They're gonna kind of crack the nut in a new way.
Yeah. Well, good. So as we finished up the panel discussion at Bixie, we had a Q&A segment, which became episode 5 for this season. And as I listened to the questions and answers, one of the consistent facts of AI data center technology is that it is progressing exponentially, with all of the top manufacturers and major companies pouring significant investments into this venture. How do you see the industry standards like the IEEEs and TIAs, Bixies, and others keeping pace with the new connectors, the architectures, products to organize these networks like they always have done for us, for our industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm actually kind of smack dab in the middle of these discussions.
Yeah.
And one thing I would say is standards, for them to be effective, they almost have to be reactive in some ways. I mean, the application has to already exist before the industry as a whole can sit down around the table and discuss the best way to define minimum performance attributes for all the various components that go into the system. Because at the end of the day, that's what standards do. They break up the system into however many parts and define each one so that it all works together. And one of the interesting comments that I wrote down during that Q&A session was Nick, and he was talking about point-to-point versus structured cabling. In the conversation, sometimes we use the term point-to-point, sometimes we say direct attach. But he said the best advocates for structured cabling are people that have done point-to-point. The best advocates for cross-connect are people that have done interconnect. And it's funny, but that's true. It's because that experience is what drives not just the creation of the standards for people, again, sitting around that table, but the acceptance of the standards. It's
Right.
easy to write a standard and say, this is the way you got to do it. But if people don't take it to heart,
Right. Believe in it.
then it's just words on paper. A couple of examples I would use of where that didn't work so well for people that are old enough. I think it came up in the conversation with Robert Henke. Category 4, which it existed for about 37 seconds back in the 90s. But more recently, like OM5 fiber, Category 8. I mean, there were standards created around it, but they came out too quickly. It wasn't reactive enough. The dust hadn't settled on how people were going to use these various technologies. It could be a little early, on the putting OM5 into that bucket, but, I would put that in there. It's not a new problem either. It's just that the market for AI clusters, it's exploded so quickly that it could be that right now the amount of pre-standard equipment that's already installed and implemented, that might be more than we've ever seen before. It's an interesting issue, but it will get addressed at the end of the day somewhere.
Yeah, it's fast paced right now, but all the people that are involved, they're all involved in these industry standard boards too, as well. So that was the panel discussion. Again, a great part. So glad we were able to implement that into this season.
Yeah, one thing
Yep.
I wanted to bring out there is, that panel discussion, when it came together, the original intent of that wasn't as part of the podcast. So kudos to Bruno Filio for having the idea to
Yeah.
to bring in microphones and record that, and maybe that could become part of the podcast episode. I think that worked out well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was great. So then I spoke with Peter Helfrich in episode 6, and Peter explains the designs that he's done with the sheer volume, density, the new products, and other complexities when implementing an AI data center. In your conversations and experience, do you see gaps in any areas that are necessary to build AI data centers, like areas that are lacking that kind of cause bottlenecks? Maybe certain types of contractors, design engineers, manufacturers, or even technology advancements that's holding this niche part of our industry back at all?
Yeah, kind of a tough one to answer, but generally I'd say there's a lot of things holding back the growth, which is kind of a surprising thing to say when you think about how fast it's growing.
Right.
But I mean, number one, really, it's the supply of chips. I mean, there really isn't enough chips. The demand is much stronger than the supply side there. But the other side, which we've talked about a bunch here, is available power. That comes up in some of the later episodes. But one of the things I think is kind of hidden from most people's view is just kind of labor and supply chain limitations, because that's probably one of the biggest factors. But going back to the last episode we talked about was the standards activity. That is kind of one of the biggest values of standards, is when that finally becomes settled, it does create a definition of, well, what are the parts that are needed? Who does it? When do you do that? And ultimately that ends up making the entire market just work more efficiently.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Once things do become standardized, even if it's before it's on paper, right? That allows competition, right? It allows more than just one manufacturer, let's say, or more than one distribution channel to be able to support a certain system or set of products.
Right. And in our first discussion before the season even kicked off, we had talked about how, 5 years ago in the data center business, people had their swim lanes, different disciplines. I didn't have to worry about what the power and cooling guy was going to do, and he didn't have to worry what the cabling guy was going to do. You just kind of implemented what you knew to do. We're in this fuzzy period where that's changing, but we'll get to the other side where it becomes simple again. I know what I need to do, and I just go and do it. And the other people do what they need to do, and it just kind of comes together at the end in a neat package.
Yeah, in focusing on or going back to that, you and David on the power grid, you and David Potts with Graybar talk about the power grid in episode 7, more specifically the lack of grid power, which also was brought up in other episodes, including Nick Taylor bringing it up in episode 4 more internationally. Do you have any insight on new locations like hotspots where power looks like they're going to be available to build new AI data centers?
Yeah, well, name a location. You could throw a dart at a map, and there's probably someone hunting down real estate in that location.
Right.
In the U.S., I would say the places that I am hearing, they're not necessarily new, but it's growing, is places like Texas and Georgia, Ohio. They seem to have become more prominent in Europe. Seeing a lot of growth in like the Nordics, whether it's Norway or Finland, but Spain, Italy. Because I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about power availability, but there's other needs that a data center needs, especially a major data center. Things like, access to the internet, environmental requirements, and there's a whole specialty in data center site selection that comes into play. There's a company called Data Center Hawk. If people aren't familiar with them, you can track them down. But they do a good job of basically tracking the real estate. They look after the real estate aspects of it from a financial perspective. But that plays into the same question.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It is some of the places you mentioned are places that I'm starting to hear more on data centers, and I haven't, Ohio was one of them that you mentioned. Wasn't in the hotspot talk a couple years ago. I mean, I'm aware of data centers and large ones that have been put there, but places like that are starting to grow as far as when people are looking for where they can build the next one. So episode 8 with Robert Henke talks about questions from clients, contractors, specifiers on AI data center design and how to dissect the answers and choices. He was really talking about these guys have all these answers and questions. They're given all this information. What does Leviton Network Solutions have to assist people out there who have questions or need education, need design support?
Hopefully, we offer a lot of things. I got bills to pay. I think you might too. First off, I really do hope people are learning from us about the technology, kind of in general terms on things like this podcast, but from the webinars that we put on and so on, whether that's one of our crosstalk webinars we put on or a Bixie conference or any place else we might be talking. So I'd say that's kind of step one, just to satisfy a general interest. But when you get down into kind of specific, if somebody has a specific problem or project, that's where you get into personal consultations. Robert is an ace, but he's not the only one. We've got a lot of people scattered across the country, and that rolls into you and your
the spec team. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. The spec engineers come in, and again, it can be a very specific problem. How do I solve this exact problem? It could be kind of project size things. Once we get an understanding of what's needed there's a whole universe of services. I mean, we get design services, we can do drawings, we have testing capabilities, we have labs that we can bring to bear in certain things. We've got product solutions that we can guide people towards. We've got distribution support. Going back to the David Potts and Graybar discussion, how do we stage this, help them stage products to make the process go more efficiently when they're actually trying to build it? So there's a whole series of things, but it starts with that initial conversation.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with the lab. I think a lot of us know us and our competition. There's people out there, right, that can help you. Some have it, some don't. Some do better, some are more streamlined otherwise. But with the labs, I think the benefit right now when I think of that and some of the people that I work with internally at Leviton is that between AI data centers and other high performing technologies, the demand to kind of push the limits of the standards. Extended distance is one version that comes to mind as well with AI data centers. It's like having that ability and that expertise and the facilities to really test out if a client has something that they need to make work or see if it's going to work, be able to test it out beforehand, find out what works, right? What what products are going to make this actually come together? Because again, with the rapid growth in some of these newer technologies or demands, we have to come up with solutions for customers and engineers. And that is a huge benefit that we have here. I know it is for me and my clients.
Yeah. The other thing I should mention along this vein that kind of happened during the course of these recordings is we became a member of the Cisco Engineering Alliance.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
That's kind of along those same lines. So now instead of it, a customer just coming to Leviton saying, all right, how do I solve this problem? All right, potentially there's this application. All right, that might involve some kind of switching technology. All right, so now, that's the thought behind that alliance. So when people go and look at that, there's a whole ecosystem of people in there. But Leviton, especially on the AI data center, specifically on the cabling side, what are some of the potential solutions that somebody might be able to implement beyond just the cabling? It's more of a true end-to-end. That's the intent anyways, a true kind of end-to-end solution. So that's, again, that our testing capabilities are really what brings things like that to the fore. The fact that we're not guessing,
Yeah,
but
right.
guessing is minimized. We can try and test things and prove it out first before we try and suggest somebody use it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of our hallmarks for sure. Testing it first, getting third-party testing, working with alliances, make us all more confident in the integrity of what we're providing to the engineers and clients out there. In episode 9 with Vladimir Kozlov with light counting, the discussion was very informative. Really, I love that episode, and from a different perspective than any of our other guests, really. Vladimir mentions global trade wars and how markets affect technology progression. What was the most significant takeaway from your conversation with Vlad?
Yeah, so I'd say Vlad's clearly he's a sharp guy. I mean, he's
Yeah.
been doing this a while, and I think I said it during the episode. I'm not sure, but I've been following him for at least 10 years. I can't remember. I remember being at North Sea Show and being invited to a presentation that he gave, but I think it was something like 10 years ago. The thing is, the way he and Light Counting, his company, the way they analyze and present information, one thing else, it is past the test of time, which is the hardest thing. When you're making predictions and people are still listening to you 10 years later, I think that's kind of the best indication that, all right, there's
Yeah.
good information we have here. But the other part is how plugged in they are into the optics industry. And it's deep because people trust them. And that's quite literally the point, that optics, where the cabling world that we live in, me and you, meets the active market where companies like NVIDIA and Cisco and Arista, that's where they live. Vlad and Light Counting sit right at that intersection. So they kind of see both sides. So to a certain extent, where if NVIDIA changes something, it may not be immediately obvious to us on the cabling side what that means. But when it feeds through the information that Vlad was talking about, again, you're talking about, markets and trade wars and all of that variables going on in the world. We don't have our fingers on those. But it
Right.
has an impact, and he can distill that down. So that to me is, again, kind of a different kind of left of center perspective on the market, but it matters.
Yeah. Great guest, great episode, and nice to see us get more well-rounded episodes in here with people like Vladimir and light counting. And then your latest episode was episode 10 with Ian Farquharson from Red Bear Tech. What are some of the key points for us to understand in your discussion on the rate of progress and technology and data centers? He was talking about how just the rate of progress is just exponential, and it goes back to some of the other pieces. But what are some of the key points that you've got from that discussion?
Yeah, my main thing with the conversation with Ian, he has such a unique background. Most of us got involved in our careers as adults, and it sounds like Ian was pulling cable before he could ride a bike. I'm not exactly sure how, I forget how old he said he was when his dad made him go to the bank and pull cable.
Right.
But out of all of the guests that we had, I think, you mentioned well-rounded a little bit ago in reference to kind of the entirety of our guests. But I think as a guest, he was probably the most well-rounded from his experience because he's literally a student of the application of artificial intelligence. He was
Yeah.
learning that before he was working in the data centers for it. He's been involved in the physical installation of the networks. He's been situated within data centers and have seen the practical, whatever, pitfalls and successes of various technologies that people have tried. So that to me was kind of the biggest thing. He brought a great perspective to kind of tie all of the lessons that we've been talking about, whether it's the advantages of structured cabling or utilizing your vendors. In a prior discussion, I'm not sure if he said it during the actual recorded session or not, but he was like, when we get involved in a cabling issue, we're going to call Leviton, have them come in. Leviton knows this better than anybody else. Why would I take the advice of somebody outside of a cabling discipline if it's a cabling issue? Go work with your vendors. And you kind of repeat that with whatever the specific situation is you're working with. I thought that was great to hear from somebody with his expertise.
Yeah. And passion.
Right.
That's what I get from Ian. Just like you said, it seems like he's had a passion for artificial intelligence for a long time, long before we've been talking about these data centers. So it really brings things together, right? To hear that perspective for someone who's had a strong interest in it for decades now. Well, that's it for season 2. I felt like we had some good momentum there, right? After season 1. Appreciate working with you, Mike, and all the guests. We'll see you in the next one.
All right. Thanks, Roy. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and nice work. Appreciate it.
Beyond Bandwidth is a podcast series produced by Leviton Network Solutions. For more information on the topics we talked about today, as well as other enterprise or data center network infrastructure content, or to check out all available episodes of Beyond Bandwidth, visit us on the web at leviton.com/beyondbandwidth or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd appreciate you leaving an honest review in your podcast application. Along with word of mouth, leaving a review will help others find our show. I'm Roy Chamberlain, and this was Beyond Bandwidth. Until next time.